Hello and welcome back to the Palmer Performance YouTube channel. In this video we're going to rebuild a Kawasaki Supersport engine together. It's already been stripped, cleaned, inspected and all the parts ordered for it. So basically it's an assembly job. I thought you guys might be interested to see the stages as we go through assembling it and the things that we check and the things that we look at and the things we adjust when we're looking to get the best out of an engine. Stay tuned. Right then, first things first. So when I'm building an engine, this sort of upper part, or it's like a higher part of my sort of engine bench area, is what I always use for laying out the parts. And I always have some sort of mat, which is generally where I assemble the conrods and the pistons and stuff on and lay everything out. Part of that comes down to my OCD and how I like to have stuff arranged. But before we even think about starting to get engine parts out of the cupboard and laying them out and start thinking about assembling it, first thing I always do is run through the parts order, tick everything off on the invoice just to make sure that we've got everything here ready to build it. So the last thing I want to do is start building it and then find out we're missing something, and then I've got to stop, put it all away and start another job whilst I'm waiting for the right part to turn up. So all these parts, all genuine Kawasaki parts, supplied by Corby Kawasaki. They are really good people when it comes to buying Kawasaki parts. Generally hold a lot of stock and a lot of oddball stuff as well, because they've been Kawasaki dealers for a very, very long time. So sometimes if you've got something older and you're struggling to find a part for it, they may have it on the shelf. So always worth a phone call to those guys. And yeah, so we will start unpacking all of this and run through it all and tick off the invoices, make sure we've got everything, and then we can crack on with some assembly. Here we go then. So I'm just unpacking the pistons first. Now everything I'm doing here is all done in the same way for every engine. I always lay the parts out in the same way. You know, the pistons laid out, the ring sets laid out. Here I'm just going through the main bearing shells and sorting them out, ticking them off the list. I've actually laid them out at the back in the order that I know they go in this engine. And then just laying out the other components, because like I said earlier, we will assemble the conrods and pistons first, and they'll get laid out on that mat in number order, you know, in cylinder order 1 to 4, with the new conrod bolts, the piston pins and everything all lined up. And it's these procedures and doing everything in the same way that helps to reduce mistakes being made. Nobody likes mistakes, we are all human, but if you have these sorts of procedures and methods and the routine of how you do these things and you stick to them, you can do them every time, then it minimizes the chance of mistakes. Just unwrapping all the big end shells and the piston pins here. And a lot of these parts, when you get them new, they come with a sort of protective coating on, and you'll see here I'm just wiping off that with some solvent just to make sure there's no contamination when we get towards assembling the parts. Now I've got the conrods out. They've already had the old conrod bolts removed. So the first job's going to be, once I've lined them all up, just giving the big end bearing shell faces a wipe here, is to put the conrod bolts in them. So they're all being dropped in, little wipe of oil on them to help them go in, and then I'll just disappear off and push them into the conrods over on the other side of the workshop. Once they are in, we will then move on to putting the big end bearing shells in, which is what I'm doing now. Quickly showed you there. And again, these have a bit of protective coating on the back, which I tend to wipe off first before putting them in. There we go. Right, now piston clips and pistons. There's a piston clip, there's a piston. Some people find these fiddly to put in. I've been putting piston clips into pistons for knocking on 25 years now. So most normal pistons, I can actually pop the piston rings in just using my thumb. And here we're just making sure we get the orientation of the conrod and the piston correct. Now on most Japanese engines, the big end bearing shell will have a tang cut out, and that generally is towards the inlet side or the back of the piston. So once all the piston pins are in and the pistons are on the rods, and then we put the clips in the other side, we can then move on to putting the piston rings on. Now you have your oil expander rings, your oil scraper rings, your second ring and your top compression ring. And generally start at the bottom, work your way up. And again, different manufacturers have different procedures as to the location of the gaps in the ring. So that is basically the first stage done. You know, we've unpacked all the parts, we've checked through them all, and then we've assembled each conrod with its new conrod bolts, its new big end shells. This particular build we're putting brand new pistons in because we want this thing to be absolutely spot on, and new pistons will always give you better performance than old pistons. So obviously we've assembled them on the rods with new piston pins, new piston clips, new piston rings, and they're all ready to go. So next job will be to get the crankcases out. We'll get them set up on the bench. We've got all the main bearing shells here, main bearings, which we'll need to pack out. They're obviously all laid out in order, like I've said, with the colours and everything. All the sizes and all the clearances have already all been checked, so we know that this is just a case of literally putting them in and assembling. We've also got here, we've got a new oil pump rotor going because the other one was a bit worn, and these are crank thrust washers, which go either side of the crankshaft in part of the crankcase. So yeah, we'll get the top crankcase out first. We will oil the cylinder bores, and then we'll show you how we fit the pistons into the bores. Obviously on this ZX6 engine, the cylinder bores are part of the top crankcase, so that is kind of the first job, is to get the pistons in so that we can turn it upside down and start fitting the crank into it. So time to move on to the main engine bench. So we've got the top crankcase out. Obviously it's already all been washed through the parts washer. It's had all the galleries blown through with brake cleaner, cleaned off with solvent, but we always give the bores an extra last wipe before then giving them a good coating of engine oil. So what I'm getting out here is a little tapered piston ring tool, and basically this is what we use for installing piston and conrod assemblies into these modern engines. You basically drop the piston into it, and it looks really easy on the hyperlapse, but you drop the piston into it, a bit of a coating of oil on the rings and everything, and then set it on top of the cylinder block and just push down, and it smoothly and easily guides and compresses the rings into the bores. With that done, we can now turn the engine over, and then I'll just mount it to the lower bracket on the bench to make sure it's all held nicely when I come to do up the conrod nuts. So again, we're just installing the main crank shells here. A quick last wipe of the bearing faces to make sure they're all clean and dry. And we're just popping the shells in, making sure that the locating tangs are in the right place. Now this is Lucas Assembly Lube. All the engines I build, they do get primed on the bench manually. They get filled with oil and then all the lubrication system primed with a battery drill. But I do tend to use this assembly lube on main bearing and big end bearing faces when I'm building the motor. We've now got the crank out. We can drop that in, pull the conrods up so they're sitting on their journals, and we can move on to installing the conrod caps. That's all the caps on. Now this is my little black book. As you can imagine, when you build plenty of different types of engines, it can take a bit of time sometimes getting all the specs and stuff out of a manual. So whenever I build an engine, I tend to write down a shorthand form of all the important specs, clearances, torque settings, etc. into my little black book, and it's basically my quick reference guide for building all the common engines I do. So here we're just putting the conrod nuts on, and then we will use the torque method on these. And I know some people will use a stretch method where you use a dial gauge on the conrod bolts and you measure how much you stretch the rod bolts. But when you're using new rod bolts and nuts, I personally do prefer using the torque method. So this particular engine, all the nuts are done up to 12.8 Newton meters. And then you add 175 degrees on top of that. So I've done the 12.8 Newton meters. Now I'm just getting out my digital torque wrench, which has a angle facility on it. They're a little bit like black magic, really, those things. I'm not entirely sure how they work, but basically you put it on the nut, you zero it, and then as you turn it, it counts the degrees for you and it beeps when you're done. Now you'll also see I've got a little Sharpie in my mouth, and that's because, again, we get back to these routines and procedures. Every time one bolt has been torqued and the degree angle done, I'll just put a little red mark on it just so I know that it's been done. It's a quick reference guide to know that you've done all the stages of doing up those bolts. And there we go, that's them done. And that is the first sort of main stage complete, really. Crank is installed, shells are installed, rods are installed, all the bolts are done up and torqued and then degreed correctly. The next step will be to get the shells into the bottom crankcase and then make sure all the O-rings, etc. and dowels are in place, and then we'll get the gasket sealant on it. This bearing here as well for the output shaft on the gearbox. It's a cassette gearbox, so that goes in after the crankcases are assembled. So yeah, we'll get the bottom crankcase out and start moving with that one. First things first is to get those main shells in the bottom case. So again, the same with the other side. We're unpacking them, giving them a little wipe down with some solvent and the bearing face in the case itself, and then just popping them into the cases. Once we've done that, just final wipe over the gasket faces to make sure they're clean and dry before we get ready to put some sealant on. And there, that's just the assembly lube going on the main bearings in the bottom case. That's the main output shaft oil seal fitted, brand new one going in there, a little wipe of oil around the inside of it. Now for all the engines in my workshop, I always use free bond gasket sealant on the crankcase sealing faces. I have a grey one and a black one. They're both slightly different, but they do exactly the same job. I just tend to like to use the grey one on silver engines and the black one on black engines. I know that seems a little bit over the top, but hey, that's just me. And a bit of special grease for the crankcase journal bolts as well. So here we go, just dabbing the sealant on in the appropriate places. Working our way around the crankcase. Making sure we've got a good even coating on and not too much as well. Nothing worse than having excess sealant clogging up your oil strainer. So now we've got the bottom case on, just putting the crankcase main journal bolts in. They are torqued in a couple of stages. So you can see we're just working through them in sequence. And then we'll move on to the smaller bolts at the front of the engine, spinning them in with the impact gun and then torquing them. And then we'll turn the engine over to do the other bolts on the top half of the crankcase. And you can see there, I just checked it turned nicely before carrying on putting bolts in. Back out with a torque wrench on the big bolts, spin the little bolts in and readjust the torque wrench for the little bolts. All good. So with the crankcases all bolted together, we've checked the crank spins and turns as it should. It's now time to install the sort of main lubrication system parts. So we've got the water pump assembly here, and that also drives the oil pump. That's the oil pump. That goes in the side of the engine there. So that's going to be the next thing we put in. We'll bolt that in. And then obviously the engine's upside down. This is the sump area. That is the pickup point for the oil pump. That has that pickup, which sits in the bottom, picks the oil up. So we'll put that in. But once the oil pump's in there, what I generally do is I put a little bit of oil into the oil pump and just give it a bit of a rotate, just to sort of prime the pump, so that when we do prime the engine on the bench, it helps pick up the oil a lot easier and quicker. That's the shaft there which drives the oil pump and water pump, which is driven off a gear off the clutch when that all goes back in. So yeah, we'll get the water pump in, water pump and oil pump in, get that primed, get the pickup on, sump gasket, get the sump itself bolted on, and once that's on, we can then flip the engine back over, get it on the bracket, and then start fitting some other parts. The ZX6 is a bit of a, it's quite common on these particular sort of era of Kawasaki 600 engines, but they run the oil cooler, or heat exchanger as I like to call them, and the oil filter actually on the top of the crankcases at the back. So once it's picked up the oil from the bottom, it actually pumps it all the way to the top of the crankcases through the oil filter and the oil cooler, and then off around the rest of the engine. So once the engine's got the sump on, we've turned it over, we can then bolt this assembly on, get an oil filter on it, get the oil cooler on it, and then start thinking about putting a cylinder head on it, I suppose. Join me in part 2, where we'll carry on building this engine and move on to installing the cylinder head and cams and such like. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe. We'll see you soon.